He laughed right in my face, treating my frustration like some petty, insecure jealousy. "She is just a friend," he said, casually letting his ex-fiancée hijack our dinners, our future plans, and the private spaces of a supposedly serious relationship. I did not argue anymore. I simply said, "Okay, then." I quietly signed a document that would alter my entire life's trajectory, stepping back to let his own secrets tear his carefully constructed world apart. My name is Avery Alexander. I am 33 years old, and for the past 4 years, I have carefully built a life defined by order, precision, and forward momentum. As a senior operations manager at Northline Civic Systems in Charlotte, North Carolina, my entire career revolves around fixing broken structures. I assess risks, streamline workflows, and ensure that every moving part of a massive city infrastructure project functions flawlessly. I am a planner. I am naturally calm under pressure. I thrive in environments where logic reigns supreme. Right now, I am standing on the edge of a significant career breakthrough, quietly waiting for a promotion that will finally validate a decade of relentless ambition. Naturally, my personal life was supposed to reflect that same predictable stability. I share a leased, light-filled apartment in South End with my boyfriend, Nolan Price. Nolan is 35 years old, a freelance creative director with the kind of effortless, disarming charm that makes people instantly lower their defenses. He is articulate, handsome in an unstudied way, and possesses this uncanny ability to make everyone in a room feel like they are the most fascinating person he has ever met. If you asked our mutual friends, they would confidently tell you Nolan is the absolute epitome of the evolved, modern man. He speaks fluent therapy jargon. He reads books on emotional intelligence. He prides himself on being emotionally available and deeply understanding of the female experience. The bitter irony, of course, is that his profound understanding of women seems exclusively reserved for one specific woman who is very much not me. Her name is Bianca Hale. She is Nolan's ex-fiancée. According to Nolan, their romantic past is ancient history, a youthful mistake made in their late 20s that cleanly and maturely transitioned into a platonic friendship. But this friendship does not look like any platonic bond I have ever witnessed in my 33 years on this earth. Bianca texts him every single day. The notifications light up his phone screen at 7 in the morning and at 11 at night. She calls him at midnight because her anxiety is acting up, and she just needs a familiar voice to ground her. She asks him out for mid-morning coffees to brainstorm for her perpetually struggling event planning business. She needs his urgent advice on difficult clients, on color palettes, on catering contracts. She calls to vent about her mother, her landlord, her chaotic dating life. And, as if governed by some cruel, invisible cosmic clock, her emotional crises always manage to detonate at the exact moments I need his undivided attention the most. In the beginning, I tried to voice my discomfort using the very communication tools Nolan claimed to value so highly. I would mention, casually at first while folding laundry or washing dishes, that a midnight phone call seemed inappropriate for someone who was merely a friend. Nolan would offer that signature, easy smile of his, reaching out to gently tuck a stray piece of hair behind my ear. "Avery, come on," he would say, his voice thick with a gentle, maddening condescension. "Do not let your insecurity talk right now. You are a smart, secure, mature woman. You know that exes can still be friends. We are adults. It is really not that deep. I am with you, not her." I absolutely hated that word. Insecurity, it felt like a perfectly laid trap. If I raised my voice, if I argued the point, I immediately proved his underlying thesis that I was jealous and unstable. If I stayed silent, I swallowed my own boundaries and digested the disrespect. So, for a very long time, I chose to swallow them. I am a rational woman. I aggressively convinced myself that this was merely a boundary issue, a frustrating blind spot in his otherwise stellar character, rather than an active, ongoing betrayal. I vehemently refused to become the paranoid, controlling girlfriend trope. I refused to be the woman secretly scrolling through her partner's phone in the dark hours of the morning. I am Avery Alexander. I manage regional infrastructure for major municipalities. I do not throw tantrums over another woman's text message. But the small, sharp details began to grate against each other, day after day, creating a constant psychological friction I could no longer ignore. It was the way Bianca still called him by his old, intimate nickname. Noli, a name I never felt comfortable using. It was the way Nolan would answer her calls halfway through our carefully planned Sunday dinners, holding his index finger up to me to signal, "Just 1 minute," while his hot food slowly grew cold on the plate. It was the glaring, undeniable fact that in the 3 years we had been living together, he had never once proactively set a hard limit with her. There was never a single instance of him saying, "Bianca, I am having dinner with Avery right now. I will call you back tomorrow." It was always immediate, unconditional access, always an open, welcoming door. Slowly, the harsh reality of our shared domestic life came into painfully sharp focus. I looked around the beautiful apartment we had supposedly built together as equals, and I saw only my own fingerprints holding the foundation together. I am the unwavering heartbeat of this household. I ensure the rent is paid on the first day of every single month, exactly on time. I schedule the internet maintenance. I buy the groceries on Sunday afternoons. I map out our mutual financial goals for the next 5 years. I provide the solid ground. Nolan, on the other hand, floats above it. He contributes financially when he has a particularly good freelance month, but mostly, he lives effortlessly in the safe, comfortable spaces I have rigorously secured for him. He paces our living room like a man waiting in an upscale airport terminal, his eyes constantly darting toward the metaphorical departure gate, waiting for something more thrilling, more dramatic, to announce boarding. This unspoken, heavy imbalance finally crystallized into a singular, undeniable truth on a Tuesday evening. It was supposed to be a rare night of pure celebration. Earlier that afternoon, I had successfully closed a massive urban restructuring project at Northline, an initiative that took 18 months of grueling, sleep-deprived labor and endless negotiations. To mark the hard-won occasion, I had spent 2 hours in our kitchen preparing pan-seared sea bass, roasting seasonal vegetables, and chilling a bottle of white wine that cost over $100, a significant splurge meant to exclusively honor this professional milestone. Nolan had actually remembered the occasion enough to buy a bouquet of fresh flowers on his way home. They were sitting right in the middle of our dining table, a bright, hopeful centerpiece that made me feel, for a fleeting second, truly cherished. We sat down across from each other. I poured the expensive wine into our glasses. I raised my glass toward him, feeling a genuine, overwhelming wave of pride and utter exhaustion wash over my shoulders. "To the end of the tunnel," I said, offering him a warm, unguarded smile. Nolan raised his glass to meet mine, his eyes soft. "To my brilliant, hard-working girl. I am so incredibly proud of you, Avery." Before the thin crystal rims could even touch to make a sound, his smartphone, resting face up right next to his silver fork, lit up the dimly lit room. The screen flashed bright white against the mahogany wood. The caller ID read, in bold black letters, "Bianca." Nolan glanced down. The soft, loving expression on his face instantly morphed into a tight look of urgent concern. He did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He did not look up into my eyes, nor did he offer a single word of apology. He simply lowered his wine glass, picked up the glowing phone, and abruptly stood up from the dinner table. "Hey, B, what is wrong?" he said, his voice instantly dropping an octave into a hushed, intimate tone as he slid the heavy glass balcony door open and stepped out into the humid Carolina night, pulling the door firmly shut behind him to block out the sound of my presence. I sat entirely alone at the beautifully set table, my glass of expensive wine still hovering uselessly in the air. I looked at the closed glass door, I looked at his empty chair, and in the deafening, heavy quiet of my own carefully managed home, I realized the most humiliating truth of all. I was not his partner. I was just the reliable, well-lit waiting room where he stayed until she called. The deepest concessions in a relationship rarely announce themselves with slamming doors or tearful ultimatums. They creep in softly, wearing the gentle, deceptive mask of compromise and love. You convince yourself you are building a shared foundation, only to realize much later that you were just handing over the bricks of your own ambition to wall yourself in. Exactly 6 months before the night he walked out to the balcony, the first real test of our foundation arrived in the form of a heavy manila folder. My regional director had called me into his glass-walled office, sliding a formal proposal across his polished mahogany desk. The company wanted me to relocate to Austin for exactly 6 months. They needed someone with my operational track record to lead a massive restructuring team for a newly acquired municipal hub. It was not just a temporary assignment. It was the unspoken, highly coveted audition for a permanent regional director position. It was the exact leap I had been quietly preparing for over the past 4 years. I drove back to our shared apartment that evening with my heart hammering a frantic, joyous rhythm against my ribs. I had the entire pitch mentally rehearsed. We could manage 6 months of long distance. We could schedule weekend flights. It would be a temporary strain for a permanent, life-altering elevation in our shared financial and professional future. I laid it all out for Nolan on our velvet living room sofa. I watched his face closely, waiting for the spark of shared excitement, the pride, or even the practical questions about logistics. Instead, his features settled into a carefully constructed mask of passive neutrality. He did not raise his voice. He did not tell me I could not take the opportunity. He was much too refined, much too versed in the language of modern, supportive partnerships to ever forbid me from doing anything. "That sounds like a massive opportunity," he said smoothly, leaning back and crossing his arms. "If you feel like you need to go, then you should absolutely go." There was a heavy, deliberate pause. I knew him well enough to recognize the invisible comma hanging in the air, waiting for the other shoe to drop. He let out a long, heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair, looking suddenly exhausted by the sheer weight of the world. "It is just incredibly bad timing, honestly." Bianca called me this afternoon in a complete panic. Her event planning agency just lost their largest corporate client. The contract was pulled without warning. She is entirely spiraling. I am talking full panic attacks. It would be genuinely cruel of me to just disappear from the city and be flying back and forth to Texas right now when she is losing her mind and needs a support system. I sat there, frozen on the velvet cushions, feeling the cold water of his logic wash over my excitement. Notice the phrasing. He did not say he needed me to stay. He made it about his indispensable role in another woman's life. He framed my career advancement as a direct threat to his ability to be the savior. The trap was brilliantly designed. If I packed my bags and moved to Austin, I would be the cold, corporate girlfriend abandoning her partner during a stressful period, leaving him entirely unchecked in his role as Bianca's emotional first responder. Our relationship would inevitably fracture under the strain of distance and his divided loyalties. But if I stayed, I would have to watch a pivotal career milestone evaporate into thin air. I chose the relationship. I called my director the very next morning and politely declined the Austin relocation. Citing pressing personal obligations, I swallowed the bitter pill of disappointment and fiercely rebranded my sacrifice. I told myself I was playing the long game. I was investing in the stability of our household. I was being the bigger, more secure partner. For a brief, intoxicating window of time, my sacrifice seemed to yield the exact dividends I desperately wanted. Nolan was overwhelmingly grateful. He surprised me with a reservation at a high-end French bistro downtown, insisting on paying the bill in full. He poured expensive red wine and held my hands across the white linen tablecloth, looking deeply into my eyes. He told me how much he respected my dedication to us, how my grounding presence was the only thing keeping him sane. For exactly 3 weeks, he was present, attentive, and remarkably unbothered by his phone. It was just enough breadcrumbs to make me believe my career concession had successfully purchased his undivided loyalty. But gratitude is a fleeting currency for a man who feeds on crisis. By the fourth week, the phantom honeymoon phase evaporated, and the familiar, suffocating patterns resumed their rightful place in our apartment. It happened on a rainy Sunday morning. We had planned to stay in, make a large breakfast, and finally paint the guest bedroom. I was literally holding a blue paint roller when his phone chimed with that specific, custom notification tone. I watched his eyes scan the screen. The text was simple, demanding, and entirely devoid of context. "I need you." Nolan immediately set down his coffee mug. He grabbed his car keys from the kitchen island with an urgency that suggested a physical emergency. He muttered something vague about Bianca having a meltdown over a vendor dispute and rushed out the front door, leaving me alone in a room covered in plastic drop cloths. He sprinted toward her chaos as if she were the one he was building a tangible, breathing life with, while I was left holding the tools to maintain the empty shell of his home. I did not scream. I did not throw the paint. I calmly cleaned up the supplies and drove to a small, independent coffee shop on the east side of town to meet my best friend, Leah Morgan. Leah is a corporate litigator who possesses absolutely zero tolerance for emotional ambiguity. She listened to me recount the morning, stirring her black coffee with a slow, measured rhythm. She did not offer pity. She offered an autopsy. "Avery, you need to stop analyzing this like it is a math problem," Leah said, her voice dropping low, piercing straight through the noisy hum of the cafe. "He is not confused. He is greedy. Nolan is maintaining two completely separate relationships at two entirely different levels of operation. He keeps you around for the stability. You are the operational manager of his life. You provide the beautiful apartment, the consistent routine, the social respectability of having a smart, successful partner. But you do not feed his ego because you do not strictly need him to survive." She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes locked onto mine. Bianca, on the other hand, is a perpetual disaster. She constantly needs rescuing. She provides the admiration, the drama, the validation that he is a vital, heroic man. He uses you to feel safe, and he uses her to feel important. You are funding the absolute luxury of his hero complex. I immediately went on the defensive. I rattled off all the standard excuses I had meticulously memorized. I told Leah about his difficult childhood, his deep sense of loyalty, his innate need to fix things. I defended the man who had abandoned me in a paint-splattered room just 2 hours prior. But as I drove back to the apartment later that afternoon, Leah's words echoed in the confined space of my car. I could no longer unsee the architecture of the trap. A tiny, imperceptible crack fractured the foundation of my absolute trust. Without consciously deciding to do so, I started a mental ledger. I began quietly archiving the data. I counted the canceled dinner reservations. I noted the weekends he suddenly had to help her move furniture. I tallied the evenings our conversations were abruptly cut short by her manufactured emergencies. The ledger grew heavy in the dark corners of my mind. The tension in our home became a tangible, suffocating entity, an invisible wire pulled so tight it hummed. I stopped bringing up her name entirely, adopting a chilling, sterile politeness that Nolan seemed completely oblivious to. The final confirmation of Leah's theory did not arrive in a screaming match. It came quietly, devastatingly. On a Tuesday night as we stood in our kitchen, I had casually, coldly asked why he needed to personally review Bianca's quarterly tax documents when she had a hired accountant. Nolan stopped wiping the granite counter. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and exhausted patience, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "Avery, it is not about the taxes," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. He leaned against the counter, shaking his head. "Bianca needs me differently. You of all people should understand that." I stared at him as the sheer, unadulterated audacity of that sentence settled into my bones. You of all people. Because I was the capable one. Because I was the strong one. Because I was the woman who gave up a massive career leap in Austin to stay in his city, only to be told that my self-sufficiency was the exact reason I deserved less of his devotion. I did not blink. I did not let a single tear form. The ledger in my mind snapped shut, fully calculated. The era of my concessions officially ended right there on the kitchen tile, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity that would eventually dismantle his entire world. Exactly 12 months after I sacrificed the Austin assignment, the corporate machinery of Northline Civic Systems presented me with an even larger, entirely undeniable mandate. I was sitting in the executive boardroom when the vice president of operations slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the mahogany table. It was Denver. This was not a temporary deployment or a lateral move. It was a direct, brightly lit pathway to the executive level. The offer included a 30% salary increase, a massive relocation budget, and full autonomy over the entire Western Seaboard development sector. My superior did not smile when he gave me the details. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and delivered a stark, professional warning. He told me that my talent was deeply valued, but the company could not keep the door open forever while I navigated my domestic logistics. He said I had 48 hours to give them a definitive answer, and if I declined again, they would permanently move on to the next candidate in line. I drove back to our shared apartment with my hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. I did not want to approach this as an ultimatum. I wanted to approach it as a joint venture, a brilliant fresh start for both of us. I spent the entire commute drafting a mental business plan for our relationship. If we moved to Colorado together, we would be stepping entirely out of the suffocating shadows of the past 3 years. We could buy a house with a yard. We could build a formidable, shared financial foundation. It would be a clean slate, a chance for his freelance creative agency to expand into a completely new, affluent market without the constant, draining distractions of his old life. When I walked through the front door, Nolan was lounging on the living room sofa, scrolling idly through his smartphone. I did not wait for the perfect moment. I sat down on the edge of the coffee table, directly facing him, and I laid out the entire Denver vision. I spoke with passion, with genuine excitement, outlining how this transition could beautifully elevate both of our lives. He did not get angry. He did not raise his voice or tell me it was impossible. Instead, he locked his screen, placed the phone face down on the cushion, and looked at me with an expression of profound, exhausted pity. He let out a soft, patronizing chuckle, slowly shaking his head as if I had just suggested something tragically absurd. Then, he delivered a sentence that would permanently lodge itself in my chest like a rusted blade. I am not cutting contact with my ex. She is just a friend. The sheer, dizzying whiplash of that statement nearly knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. I sat there in stunned silence. I had not mentioned Bianca. I had not uttered a single syllable of her name since I walked into the room. I had been talking about real estate markets, career trajectories, and our shared future in a new time zone. But his mind had immediately, instinctively snapped to the defense of his other life. In his head, a move to Denver was not about our upward mobility. It was exclusively about his geographical separation from her. When I pointed out this glaring, terrifying fact, he seamlessly pivoted. He transformed the entire conversation from a matter of basic relational boundaries into a clinical indictment of my personality. He leaned forward, his voice taking on that calm, therapeutic tone that I had grown to absolutely loathe. He told me I was projecting. He said my proposition to move across the country was a thinly veiled, highly manipulative attempt to isolate him from his core support system. He looked me dead in the eyes and called me overly sensitive, deeply possessive, and entirely too insecure to function in a modern, evolved partnership. He claimed that mature adults did not act like this, and that it was genuinely exhausting to constantly manage my irrational jealousy over a purely platonic dynamic. He did not just reject the move, he gaslit me into apologizing for even suggesting we prioritize our own relationship. I spent the next 2 days trapped in a psychological spiral, desperately analyzing my own sanity, wondering if I truly was the toxic, controlling villain he so calmly painted me to be. as if to actively punish me for daring to challenge the established order. The digital disrespect escalated almost immediately. Bianca began appearing heavily on Nolan's social media feeds. It was never anything explicitly romantic, because plausible deniability was his absolute favorite weapon. It was an aesthetic, black and white photograph of 2 coffee cups resting on a rustic table, tagging her event planning company. It was a candid, beautifully lit shot of the 2 of them looking intensely at a laptop screen in a boutique cafe, their shoulders pressed firmly together, accompanied by the caption about late-night creative meetings. To any outside observer mindlessly scrolling through their feed, they looked exactly like a young, ambitious, deeply connected couple building a glamorous empire together. I was completely invisible. I was the silent ghost haunting my own life, funding the apartment he returned to after these highly publicized creative sessions. The absolute breaking point arrived on a Thursday evening. A mutual acquaintance from his university days left a comment under a photograph of Nolan and Bianca standing close together at an art gallery opening. The comment was public, visible to hundreds of people, and painfully direct. "You two are the absolute perfect match. Such a power duo." I sat alone in our bedroom, the blue light of my phone screen illuminating the dark room, waiting for Nolan to issue a polite but firm correction. I waited for him to type a casual reply stating they were just colleagues. I waited for him to mention my name. I waited for the absolute bare minimum defense of my existence as his partner. Nolan did not correct the friend. He did not clarify his relationship status. He did not defend our 3 years of shared history. He simply replied to the comment with a single, crying laughing emoji, letting the assumption stand entirely unchallenged. That tiny, pixelated yellow face broke something fundamental and irreparable inside my mind. Staring at the screen, the final piece of the puzzle violently clicked into place. I finally realized that the deepest, most agonizing pain was not the simple fact that Bianca existed in his orbit. The true, suffocating agony was the undeniable reality that Nolan actively curated her presence in a way that deliberately blurred my own position. He kept her firmly bathed in the warm spotlight while systematically shoving me into the cold, silent backstage to manage the tedious logistics of his real life. He did not just allow people to think they were together, he actively enjoyed the vanity of it. The following morning, I sat at our kitchen island alone. The apartment felt unnaturally still. I opened my company laptop, drafted a brief, sterile, 2-sentence email to the vice president of operations, and quietly declined the Denver promotion, citing unforeseen personal obligations. I clicked send, watching the loading bar vanish across the screen, taking my entire executive future with it. I closed the laptop and walked slowly into the master bathroom. I stood perfectly still under the harsh, humming fluorescent light and stared deeply into my own reflection. I looked at the tired, heavy lines forming around my eyes. I looked at the successful, highly educated woman who managed millions of dollars in civic infrastructure, but could not manage to demand a single ounce of basic respect in her own home. I placed my hands flat against the cold porcelain sink. For the very first time since I met Nolan Price, a terrifying, icy question settled deep into my bones. Was I actually in love with this man, or was I simply being aggressively, systematically trained to accept substantially less than I deserved? The call came on a brisk Tuesday morning, completely bypassing my immediate regional supervisor and originating directly from the Chief Operating Officer of Northline Civic Systems. When you receive a direct line from the executive suite on a random weekday, you immediately close your office door and sit down. I held the receiver against my ear, listening intently as the voice on the other end outlined a proposition that felt significantly less like a standard corporate offer and vastly more like a final verdict on my professional worth. The company was officially launching the East Coast Recovery Hub in Boston. It was a massive, unprecedented undertaking, an entire infrastructural division built entirely from the ground up to manage multi-city logistical operations. They wanted me to serve as the lead director for the entire initial setup phase. The compensation package they laid out was nothing short of staggering. It included a base salary increase of 40%, a full corporate housing allowance for the first 12 months, an unrestricted operational budget to personally recruit and hire my own management team, and a heavily documented guaranteed track to vice president of operations within 3 to 5 years. However, the unparalleled generosity of the package was firmly tethered to a cold, undeniable reality. The executive on the phone did not mince his words. He explicitly noted my previous 2 rejections for the Austin and Denver relocations. He stated, with chilling corporate politeness, that the company had shown immense grace regarding my personal timing, but this was the absolute final stretch of that grace. If I declined Boston, they would permanently remove my file from the executive succession pipeline and hand the entire hub to another candidate. There would be no fourth offer. The window was closing, and they needed my final answer by the following morning. I left the office early that afternoon. I did not drive home in a state of panic, nor did I feel the joyous celebration one might expect after securing a life-altering promotion. Instead, I drove through the city traffic with the heavy, calculated focus of a woman preparing for a high-stakes trial. That evening marked exactly 3 years since we had signed the lease and moved our boxes into our shared apartment. It was a domestic anniversary we typically acknowledged with expensive takeout and a movie on the sofa. But tonight, I needed the physical setting to hold the profound, defining weight of my ultimate question. I was going to ask him, directly and without any protective padding, if he was truly committed to building a permanent, equitable future with me. I needed to know, once and for all, if I was an actual partner in his life, or merely a heavily subsidized, emotionally convenient safety net while he managed a different reality. I spent 3 consecutive hours meticulously preparing the evening. I wanted the environment to reflect the absolute seriousness of the conversation I was about to initiate. I roasted a delicate rack of lamb, stood over the stove to perfectly reduce a complex red wine sauce, and set our dining table with the expensive plates and the polished silver cutlery we rarely ever touched. The entire apartment smelled of roasted garlic, fresh rosemary, and the heavy, undeniable anticipation of a defining moment. The candles were lit, casting a warm, flickering glow over the dining room. Everything was entirely perfect. He walked through the front door at exactly 7 o'clock, tossing his keys into the ceramic bowl by the entryway. He paused in the hallway, taking in the dim, atmospheric lighting, the gleaming silver, the elaborate meal waiting patiently on the table. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine appreciation crossed his face. He offered a warm smile, shrugging off his jacket, and walked purposefully toward the dining area, entirely oblivious to the heavy ultimatum sitting silently in my mind. Before he could even pull his chair out from under the table, his smartphone began to vibrate violently against the polished mahogany wood. We both instinctively looked down. The screen illuminated the dim room, displaying a rapid, frantic succession of text messages, followed almost immediately by an incoming call. The name on the screen was a glaring, intrusive beacon that instantly shattered the carefully constructed peace of the room. It was Bianca. The warm, appreciative smile vanished from his face instantly, immediately replaced by the tight, hyper-focused mask of a first responder arriving at a disaster zone. He picked up the device, sliding his thumb across the screen to answer the call before the second ring could even finish sounding in the room. I sat perfectly still in my chair, listening to the muffled, chaotic frequency of her voice bleeding through the small speaker. Her designated venue for a major, career-defining client pitching event had just canceled their reservation at the last minute due to a severe plumbing issue. She was entirely spiraling into a full-blown panic attack. I could hear her weeping loudly, hyperventilating through the phone, claiming she was entirely unable to function. She was aggressively insisting that he was the only person who possessed the necessary industry contacts to secure a premium backup location by the following morning. He did not hesitate for a single second. He did not tell her to calm down and call her own event staff. He did not look at the elaborate anniversary dinner slowly cooling on the plates directly in front of him. He simply ended the call, turned his back to the table, walked directly back to the coat rack by the door, and pulled his jacket firmly back over his shoulders. I remained seated at the table, my hands resting quietly in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up and demand that he stay. I simply watched him seamlessly prioritize her manufactured, dramatic emergency over the very foundation of our shared life. He stopped briefly by the edge of the dining table, zipping up his jacket, his eyes deliberately avoiding direct contact with mine. He looked down at his phone, which was still lighting up repeatedly with dozens of follow-up messages from her, outlining her panic in real time. Then, he finally looked up at me. His jaw was set in a hard, defensive line. He was entirely anticipating the massive fight he believed I was about to initiate. He spoke with a sharp, commanding edge, entirely devoid of any genuine apology or regret. "Do not start this tonight. All right?" he said, his tone carrying the heavy, deeply insulting implication that I was the one about to ruin the evening with unreasonable demands. "She is literally having a breakdown, and I am the only one who can fix this mess for her. It is an emergency. I will be back as soon as I can. Just eat without me." I looked quietly at the man standing in front of me. I looked at the beautiful, untouched food that I had spent hours carefully preparing as a testament to our 3 years of shared history. I looked at the glowing screen of his phone, illuminating the absolute, undeniable truth of my permanent position in his hierarchy of importance. In that exact moment, I felt the final, invisible thread binding me to this exhausting illusion snap completely in half. The tension vanished. There was no burning anger left inside my chest. There was no desperate, agonizing need to be chosen or prioritized. There was only a profound, freezing clarity that washed over my entire body. I finally understood that you cannot negotiate your worth with a man who is continuously profiting from your willingness to accept less. I met his defensive gaze perfectly. I did not cry a single tear. I did not offer a single word of protest, nor did I deliver a dramatic ultimatum about choosing between her or me. I drew in a slow, even breath, and I replied with a voice so soft, calm, and light that it barely disturbed the quiet air in the dining room. "Okay." He blinked rapidly, momentarily entirely disoriented by the sheer, unexpected lack of resistance. He lingered by the table for a fraction of a second, his posture tense, waiting for the trap to spring, waiting for the screaming match to inevitably begin. When the silence in the room remained entirely unbroken, he swallowed hard, turned on his heel, and walked out the door. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt echoed loudly in the quiet apartment, sealing his decision. I did not throw the expensive porcelain plates against the wall. I did not pour the expensive red wine down the kitchen sink. I calmly picked up my silver fork and ate my dinner in the quiet, absolute solitude of my own home. I tasted the fresh rosemary. I tasted the perfectly cooked lamb. When I was finished, I washed the dishes, dried them meticulously with a towel, and put them away in the high cupboards. I turned off the dining room lights, went to bed, and for the first time in years, I slept through the entire night without waking up once to check if he had returned. The next morning broke with a bright, harsh light streaming through the bedroom blinds. He was asleep in the guest room, having returned at some unknown hour of the early dawn. The apartment was completely silent. There were no leftover arguments hanging heavy in the air. There were no tearful demands for an explanation awaiting him. The era of my endless compromises and negotiations had officially expired. I brewed a fresh pot of black coffee, poured a cup, and sat down at the kitchen island. I opened my laptop, pulled up my corporate email directory, and located the direct contact number for the chief operating officer. I dialed the number, listening to the dial tone. He answered on the second ring. I did not offer any hesitation, any apologies for calling early, or any conditional clauses about my current living situation. I simply stated who was calling and calmly informed him that I formally accepted the position as the lead director for the East Coast Recovery Hub in Boston. I told him I would be fully ready to commence the massive transition process immediately. I ended the call, closed the laptop, and took a slow, deep sip of my dark coffee. The trap had not just been opened, I had quietly walked right out of it, and the man sleeping soundly down the hall had absolutely no idea that his perfectly balanced world was about to fundamentally collapse. The digital ink on my employment contract with Northline Civic Systems dried in absolute pristine silence. Within 48 hours of my phone call with the executive suite, I had legally bound myself to a new life in Massachusetts. I spent my lunch break sitting in my glass-walled office, methodically navigating the human resources portal, organizing my transition schedule, and selecting a fully furnished corporate apartment in the Back Bay neighborhood of Boston. I drafted an exhaustive list of the personal belongings I would ship north and the furniture I would permanently leave behind. I logged into the Federal Postal Service website and quietly arranged for my mailing address to be formally forwarded to a temporary corporate postal box starting in exactly 3 weeks. I did not breathe a single word of this to Nolan. For the very first time in over 3 years, a massive, life-altering decision did not have to pass through the suffocating filter of his approval or the perpetual dramatic demands of Bianca Hale. I did not have to weigh my career against her fragile mental state. I did not have to negotiate my ambition. The sheer, terrifying liberation of keeping this secret felt like drawing my first full breath of oxygen after years of suffocating underwater. When a woman stops asking for permission to live her own life, she naturally stops speaking. And when you finally stop talking, you begin to see everything with a razor-sharp, horrifying clarity. Freed from the exhausting burden of constantly trying to communicate my boundaries, I simply became an observer in my own home. I watched Nolan operate, and the patterns I had previously tried to excuse as mere thoughtlessness revealed themselves as a highly calculated system of disrespect. I noticed that his phone screen lit up with her name almost every single morning at exactly 7 o'clock while I was pouring my first cup of coffee. I watched him lie in our bed, the duvet pulled over his chest, his fingers rapidly typing out long text messages to her, while my head was resting just inches away on the neighboring pillow. His professional life, which had always been somewhat fluid, suddenly became incredibly rigid with unexplained absences. He started leaving the apartment for vague client meetings on Tuesday evenings and Thursday afternoons, dressed impeccably, smelling faintly of expensive cologne. He would return hours later, energized and entirely devoid of the stress that usually accompanied his actual freelance graphic design pitches. My silence also allowed me to finally look at the raw, unvarnished math of our shared existence, because my mind was no longer clouded by the emotional chaos he constantly manufactured. My innate operational instincts took over. One Sunday afternoon, while he was out on another one of his mysterious weekend errands, I sat down at the kitchen island and pulled up our joint banking ledger alongside my personal credit card statements. The financial reality laid out on the screen was nothing short of a revelation. The burden of our life together was not shared. It was entirely, heavily tilted onto my shoulders. I was covering 100% of the electric bill, the high-speed fiber internet, and the comprehensive renter's insurance, but it went deeper than the standard utilities. For the past 4 months, I had been quietly transferring funds to cover the $200 monthly fee for his designated parking space in our building's secure garage. He had casually mentioned a temporary cash flow issue with a delayed invoice back in the spring, and I had simply absorbed the cost without a second thought, wanting to be a supportive partner. Looking at the highlighted rows of numbers, a cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. I was not just his girlfriend, I was his primary investor. I was fully subsidizing his cost of living, providing him with a pristine, stress-free domestic headquarters so he could direct all of his surplus time, energy, and remaining finances toward whatever reality he was building with her. The final, undeniable confirmation that our apartment had been fully compromised arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the form of a medium-sized cardboard box. I had taken the afternoon off to quietly pack some out-of-season clothing. The building concierge rang the intercom to announce a package delivery. When I opened the front door, the courier handed me a heavily taped box from a premium corporate printing service. I looked down at the shipping label. The delivery address was undeniably my apartment, but the name printed boldly across the top line was Bianca Hale. I placed the box on the kitchen counter and stared at it as if it were a live explosive. When Nolan returned home 2 hours later, I pointed to the cardboard squarely sitting next to the fruit bowl. "A package arrived today," I said, my voice completely devoid of any inflection. "It has Bianca's name on it." Nolan barely even glanced at it. He walked to the refrigerator, opened a bottle of sparkling water, and offered a dismissive, entirely practiced shrug. "Oh, right," he said casually, taking a sip. "She was having some issues with package thieves at her complex, so she asked if she could borrow our secure address for a few important business deliveries. It is just for convenience. I will run it over to her place tomorrow." He turned his back to me and walked toward the living room, completely unbothered, as if using my leased sanctuary as a mail drop for his ex-fiancée was a perfectly normal neighborly favor. That specific, casual answer chilled the blood in my veins. This was no longer just a matter of emotional ambiguity or blurred relational boundaries. This was a massive, structural violation. Nolan was actively weaving the tangible logistics of Bianca's daily life into the physical space I paid for. He was making our home an extension of hers. I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt that very evening. When he went to the gym the next morning, I did not just observe. I audited. I opened the shared tablet we kept in the living room, a device whose email application was still linked to his primary account. I bypassed the personal messages and went straight into the archived folders and digital receipts. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a sickening precision. I found email confirmations for a climate-controlled commercial storage unit rented just 2 miles from our apartment, paid for using a credit card ending in digits I did not recognize. I found digital receipts from high-end steakhouses and exclusive rooftop lounges, time-stamped on the exact same Thursday evenings he had claimed to be grinding through late-night solo client meetings. I cross-referenced the dates and times of those expensive dinners with Bianca's public social media footprint. The correlation was flawless. On the exact night, Nolan expensed a $200 dinner for two. Bianca had posted a photograph of a luxurious dessert on a familiar marble table, captioning it about celebrating new beginnings with her favorite visionary. I closed the tablet, feeling a strange, icy calm settle over my entire body. There were no tears left to cry. The betrayal was so profoundly practical, so deeply rooted in financial and logistical manipulation, that it entirely bypassed my heart and went straight to my intellect. He was not a confused man torn between two loves. He was a highly organized opportunist, running a very specific, calculated operation. The final piece of evidence presented itself not on a digital screen, but in the heavy oak wood of his own desk. That weekend, while packing my home office supplies into a discreet tote bag, I realized I needed a single physical postage stamp to mail a final change of address form to my bank. I walked into the guest room, which doubled as Nolan's creative workspace, and pulled open the top drawer of his desk. I pushed aside a scatter of loose pens and old notebooks. Beneath them lay a thick, pristine manila folder. It was not labeled with the name of his usual freelance agency. Written across the tab in bold, black marker, were 3 words: M&H Concepts. It was a completely unfamiliar name. I slowly lifted the cover of the folder. Inside was a stack of freshly printed legal documents. It looked like the foundational paperwork for a limited liability company. I scanned the first page, my eyes locking onto the designated signature lines at the bottom of the crisp white paper. There were 2 names formally printed under the lines, establishing the foundational partners of this mysterious new venture. The first name was Nolan Price. The second name, printed right beside his in equal bold lettering, was Bianca Hale. I waited until the architecture of my exit was entirely bulletproof. The corporate relocation contract was signed in permanent ink. My transition timeline was rigorously mapped out with my superiors, and the final handover meetings were firmly scheduled on the company calendar. Only when the logistics were perfectly concrete, leaving absolutely no room for debate, negotiation, or emotional sabotage, did I finally bring the hammer down. It was a mundane Thursday evening. Exactly 21 days remained before my scheduled flight north. Nolan was sitting casually at the kitchen island, idly scrolling through his tablet, a glass of sparkling water resting near his elbow. The domestic tranquility of the room was a perfect, fragile pane of glass just waiting to be shattered. I poured myself a cup of hot tea, stood on the opposite side of the marble counter, and looked directly at him. I did not preface my statement with an apology, a sigh, or a gentle warning. I simply stated the unvarnished fact, delivering the information as cleanly as a surgical incision. "I am moving to Boston in exactly 3 weeks," I said, my voice steady and completely level. I accepted the executive director position for the new East Coast Recovery Hub. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. He froze entirely, his thumb hovering motionless over the glowing screen of his device. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the sophisticated, deeply emotionally intelligent persona he so carefully cultivated completely short-circuited. His brain could not process a narrative where he was not the central, controlling variable. When he finally looked up, his reaction was a flawless, textbook execution of exactly what I had anticipated. He did not ask if I was happy about the massive promotion. He did not ask if I felt overwhelmed by the logistics of an upcoming interstate transition. He completely bypassed my professional triumph and drove straight into the core of his own bruised ego, his face contorted into a mask of righteous, offended indignation. "Excuse me?" he demanded, his voice rising sharply in volume as he dropped the tablet onto the counter. "You are moving? You made a massive, life-altering decision like that without even bothering to sit down and discuss it with me? How could you possibly think that is an acceptable way to treat a partner in a serious relationship?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, savoring the absolute, freezing calm washing over my nervous system. The power dynamic in the room had just violently inverted, and he was entirely too blind to his own narcissism to realize it yet. I set the ceramic mug down on the counter, folding my hands together. "I learned from the absolute best," I replied, staring cleanly and unapologetically into his angry eyes. "You never once felt the need to consult me, or ask for my input. When you consistently placed another woman at the very front of your priority list, I am simply matching your established standard of unilateral decision-making." The color drained from his face in an instant. The direct mention of his meticulously guarded blind spot threw him entirely off balance. The righteous anger faltered, replaced by a sudden, panicked realization that his primary source of stability was actively walking out the door. He immediately scrambled to regain control of the narrative, instinctively reaching for his absolute favorite weapon, psychological deflection. His posture softened drastically. The aggressive indignation evaporated, replaced by a frantic, patronizing gentleness that made my skin crawl. "Avery, you are completely overreacting," he said, stepping around the kitchen island in an attempt to close the physical distance between us, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "This is about her again? I have told you 100 times. Bianca is just a deeply complex part of my past. She is absolutely no threat to what we have built right now. You are literally throwing away years of our life together over an irrational, petty insecurity. You are self-sabotaging." When I did not flinch, step back, or offer a tearful rebuttal to his accusations, desperation began to bleed visibly into his voice. He realized the gaslighting was no longer effective, so he pivoted to bargaining. He offered a classic, non-committal compromise designed to keep me securely on the hook without requiring any actual change on his end. "Look, let us just take a breath," he pleaded, his tone adopting a fake, collaborative warmth. "Just go to Massachusetts first, get settled into the corporate housing and start the new job. We will temporarily adjust to the distance, and I promise you, I will rearrange some boundaries here on my end. I will step back from her crises. Just give me a minute to fix the optics and sort things out." That specific phrase hit the air and hung there, illuminated by invisible neon lights. Rearrange some boundaries. The sheer audacity of that offer snapped my final, lingering tether to this exhausting illusion. It was the ultimate insult masked as a concession. If legitimate boundaries were actually a viable option, they would have been firmly established on day one. They would have existed over 3 years ago. They would not magically materialize only in the final hour, dangling in front of my face like cheap bait simply because I had finally placed one foot out the door. He was essentially admitting that he always possessed the ability to protect our relationship. He simply never felt I was worth the effort until his own comfort was directly threatened. I did not raise my voice to initiate a screaming match. I did not formally announce a dramatic breakup, hurl insults, or demand he pack his bags and vacate the premises. The absolute absence of my anger was far more lethal than any shouting could ever be. I took a deliberate step back, ensuring a clear, cold physical space remained between us. "I am no longer interested in standing in line," I told him quietly, my tone entirely devoid of any residual warmth, affection, or hesitation. "I am absolutely done waiting in the lobby of my own home for a man to eventually decide if I have earned the right to be his primary focus. The lease remains in both of our names for another 2 months. You can figure out your own logistics from here. I am packing my office tonight." I turned my back on him and walked down the hallway, leaving him standing alone in the kitchen, completely paralyzed by a woman who had finally, permanently stopped playing by his rigged rules. 5 days later, I landed at Logan International Airport in Massachusetts. The stinging, crisp air of the Northeast felt like a physical cleanse after the suffocating humidity of my life in Carolina. The corporate relocation team had scheduled a rigorous afternoon of surveying upscale short-term apartments in the historic district. I was standing in the middle of a stunning sun-drenched living room with original hardwood floors, overlooking the sprawling city skyline. I was breathing in the quiet, tangible weight of my brand-new reality when my phone vibrated sharply in my heavy winter coat pocket. I pulled the device out. It was a direct message from Leah. There was no accompanying text, no words of warning, and no context provided. There was just a single, high-resolution screenshot taken directly from a private, restricted social media story. The account belonged to Bianca Hale. The image was perfectly curated, a masterclass in plausible deniability designed to send a message without leaving a definitive footprint. It showed the sleek, polished surface of a high-end, dimly lit bar table. Resting on the dark wood was a tall crystal flute filled with expensive, bubbling champagne. Right next to the delicate glass, resting casually on the table, was a man's hand. I did not need to see the face attached to the arm. I recognized the distinct silver watch strapped to the wrist immediately. I had purchased that exact watch for his 30th birthday, handing it to him over a private dinner I had fully paid for. The caption hovering near the bottom edge of the photograph was vague, profoundly arrogant, and entirely damning. It read, "Phase 1, finally." I stared at the screen as the background noise of the Boston traffic outside the window faded away. The bomb had successfully been dropped in that kitchen back in Carolina, but looking at the gleaming silver watch and the crystal glass of champagne, I fully realized that the true, devastating explosion was still waiting patiently in the dark. The morning after I saw that photograph on my phone screen, the freezing Massachusetts wind rattling the heavy glass windows of my new corporate apartment matched the exact temperature in my chest. I did not waste a single second shedding tears over a man who was actively toasting to my departure with expensive champagne. Instead, I poured a cup of black coffee, sat down at my pristine glass dining table, and initiated a forensic audit of my own life. I needed absolute, undeniable facts. I picked up my phone and called an old university acquaintance who worked as a certified public accountant, specializing in small business formations back in Carolina. I gave him the 3 specific words I had discovered in that hidden manila folder inside the desk drawer: M&H Concepts. I asked him to run a quiet, comprehensive sweep of all public commercial registries and corporate tax filings in the state. It took him less than 24 hours to return my call with the official documentation. Listening to him read the public filings over the phone felt like having the remaining oxygen meticulously vacuumed out of the room. M&H Concepts was not a vague idea, a hypothetical future project, or a casual hobby. It was a fully incorporated limited liability company, officially registered with the state exactly 4 months prior. The founding members listed on the legal charter held an exact 50-50 ownership split. Their names were Nolan Price and Bianca Hale. Their declared area of commercial operation was high-end event experience curation and boutique brand consulting. The puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening, audible click that echoed in the quiet of my new apartment. Every single time Nolan had claimed he was merely offering a little free advice to an old friend. Every time he rushed out the door to rescue her failing solo agency from a manufactured disaster. He was actually attending executive strategy meetings for their own shared enterprise. As I stared at the digital copies of the registration forms my accountant friend had securely emailed to me, the true, deeply parasitic nature of our relationship finally unspooled in its entirety. This was never a tragic, romantic story about a man helplessly caught between a comfortable present and a passionate past. This was a highly calculated, cold-blooded financial strategy. While I was bearing the crushing weight of our shared living expenses, diligently paying the monthly rent, covering the utility bills, and even floating his parking garage fees, I was unwittingly functioning as his private angel investor. By entirely subsidizing his daily survival and maintaining the pristine aesthetic of our home, I provided Nolan with the ultimate luxury, a massive financial buffer. Because he did not have to worry about putting a roof over his head or keeping the lights on, he possessed the unrestricted freedom to funnel every spare dollar and every spare hour of his freelance income directly into a startup venture with another woman. I was not his partner. I was his foundational infrastructure. I was the silent, reliable engine powering his secret ambition. The realization deepened into something far more grotesque when I reviewed the secondary operational details of their newly minted company. The registered business agent address on their state tax documents was a commercial postal box, but the secondary mailing address designated for direct vendor correspondence and physical sample deliveries was exactly where I had received that cardboard box just weeks prior. They had actively interwoven their illicit corporate entity into the physical sanctuary I paid for. He had turned the living room where I slept into a secure logistics hub for his betrayal. The final, fatal blow to whatever lingering illusions I held did not come from a financial document. It came from a digital ghost. Before leaving Carolina, my meticulous operational habits had compelled me to run a full data backup of the shared tablet we kept in the living room, ensuring no stray personal banking information of mine was left behind on the local drive. On my third night in the new city, I ran a search query through that archived data dump, looking for any other vendor receipts tied to their company name. Instead of receipts, my search algorithm caught a fragmented thread of cached instant messages. Because Nolan was profoundly lazy with his digital security, his cloud account had seamlessly synced a conversation he had held with Bianca over a secure messaging application. The timestamps corresponded to exactly 2 weeks after I had turned down the massive Denver promotion to stay by his side. I sat perfectly still in the dim light of my apartment, my eyes scanning the harsh blue text on the screen. Bianca had been pushing him aggressively about timelines, asking when he was going to finally separate his living situation and go public with their partnership. Nolan's response was typed out in plain, unforgiving English. He told her she needed to be patient and trust the process. He explicitly wrote that I was great for his current stability, but I was absolutely not the woman he envisioned building a long-term legacy with. He called me too corporate, too rigid, and entirely lacking the creative fire they shared. In the very next message, he reassured her that they just needed my apartment and my predictable, high-earning income for another 6 to 8 months until M&H Concepts secured its first major round of seed funding. He was effectively keeping me on a retainer. Meanwhile, whenever I had asked him about our future, he had looked me directly in the eyes, held my hands, and sworn that she was nothing more than a complicated, entirely platonic ghost from his 20s. The betrayal mutated entirely in my mind. The deepest wound was no longer about physical infidelity or emotional wandering. It was about profound, deliberate, and sustained utility. He had actively harvested my ambition, my financial security, and my deeply ingrained sense of loyalty, using all of it as raw construction material to build a completely separate door. And he fully intended to walk out of that door the exact moment his new venture could financially sustain him. Most women, upon discovering that their entire life had been used as a heavily subsidized stepping stone for their partner and his ex-fiancée, would have immediately bought a return plane ticket. They would have stormed back into that Carolina apartment, screamed until their vocal cords tore, smashed the expensive dinner plates against the walls, and demanded a tearful audience for their agony. I am not most women. My profession requires me to dismantle broken, inefficient systems and rebuild them with absolute, unyielding precision. Anger is a wildly inefficient emotion. It is loud, it is messy, and above all else, it prematurely alerts your target that a retaliatory strike is imminent. I did not send Nolan a single angry text message. I did not call him to confront him with the cached emails, the synced messages, or the corporate registration documents. I maintained absolute radio silence regarding my discoveries. Instead, the very next morning, I picked up the phone and retained one of the most ruthless property and contract lawyers in the greater Charlotte metropolitan area. Over the next 5 days, I operated with lethal, quiet efficiency. I directed my lawyer to formally draft a legal severance of my obligations to the shared residential lease, utilizing a highly specific clause regarding out-of-state corporate relocation that allowed me to extract my name and my financial liability with exactly 30 days of formal notice. I systematically transferred every single utility account, the internet service, and the renter's insurance exclusively into his name, ensuring the entire weight of the billing cycle would crash down on him the exact moment my final month concluded. I meticulously organized every single piece of evidence. I created a secure, heavily encrypted digital vault containing the limited liability company registration, the cached text messages detailing his financial exploitation, the vendor receipts, and the concrete proof that he was using my leased residential property for unapproved commercial purposes without my consent. I secured the perimeter of my new life, legally and financially barricading myself from any potential fallout of his impending collapse. I decided right then, looking out over the sprawling, illuminated city below my window, that my retaliation would not be a dramatic, screaming spectacle in a shared kitchen. It would not be a messy public argument filled with hollow apologies. My retaliation would be a perfectly timed, flawlessly executed demolition. I was going to let him believe he was still the smartest, most in-control man in the room, right up until the exact second I pulled the foundational floorboards directly out from under his feet. When a master manipulator realizes his primary source of gravity is actively escaping his orbit, his immediate reaction is never a graceful, accountable exit. It is a frantic, deeply erratic scramble for leverage. In the 14 days following my initial relocation to Massachusetts, Nolan transformed our digital communication into a wildly swinging pendulum of psychological warfare. He rotated through every conceivable persona in his extensive arsenal, sometimes entirely contradicting himself within the span of a single afternoon. On Monday mornings, he would flood my phone with sweeping, poetic apologies, claiming his profound fear of my towering corporate ambition had driven him to pull away in a moment of pure weakness. By Tuesday evenings, the remorse would sour into righteous, bitter anger, accusing me of throwing away 3 solid years of shared history without offering him a proper chance to fix things. By Thursday, he would cast himself as the tragic, helpless victim of Bianca's relentless emotional demands, insisting she was a manipulative, chaotic force he simply could not shake because of their deeply intertwined past. Sensing that his usual emotional levers were striking solid iron, he attempted a preemptive, highly sanitized confession regarding his professional life. During a painfully tense phone call, he casually mentioned that he and Bianca were collaborating on a minor side project. He framed it as a strictly financial endeavor, a brief, meaningless opportunity to generate some extra freelance income. He swore blindly that the business arrangement held absolutely zero romantic significance. Yet, in the exact same breath, he gravely confessed that he felt a deep, inescapable sense of responsibility for her well-being because of their complicated history. He wanted me to pity his noble burden while simultaneously serving as the silent bankroller that allowed him to carry it. But a liar's carefully balanced ecosystem requires all participants to faithfully play their designated roles, and Bianca was rapidly losing her composure. The illusion of her silent, superior victory was crumbling as Nolan's panic visibly escalated. On a chilly Saturday afternoon, my phone screen illuminated with a direct message from a number I had deliberately never saved. It was a long, aggressively polite paragraph, dripping with territorial venom. She told me she felt compelled, woman to woman, to offer some much-needed clarity. She wrote that she and Nolan had never completely ended, that their souls were fundamentally tethered, and she essentially thanked me for keeping him company while they navigated their necessary time apart. She was desperately trying to seize the pen and rewrite the narrative, attempting to cast my departure as her ultimate triumph rather than my autonomous, calculated escape. I read the message twice, deleted it without a single keystroke of a reply, and calmly continued drinking my coffee. She was fighting for a prize I had already thrown in the trash. I flew back to Charlotte 4 days later to execute the final stage of my physical extraction. I needed to pack the remaining bulk of my personal belongings, my extensive library of books, and the winter coats I had left behind in the primary closet. When I unlocked the front door of our apartment, I was met with a deeply unsettling, surreal atmosphere. Nolan was operating under a bizarre, entirely fabricated delusion of normalcy. I bumped into our next-door neighbor in the hallway, who warmly asked how my temporary corporate training course in New England was going. Nolan had systematically lied to our social circle, his family, and our neighbors, explicitly telling everyone that I was simply out of town on a short-term, 3-week assignment. He was desperately attempting to preserve the pristine optics of our relationship to the outside world, buying himself enough time to figure out how to keep me contained in his reality. I ignored his desperate theater and moved methodically through the rooms, wrapping glassware in thick paper and boxing up my office. On the second afternoon of packing, I knelt on the carpet of our bedroom to empty the very bottom drawer of a heavy oak dresser. It was a space typically reserved for old winter sweaters and vacuum-sealed blankets, a place he confidently assumed I would blindly toss into a donation bag without a thorough inspection. But my hands brushed against a stiff, folded piece of premium cardstock wedged beneath a stack of wool scarves. I pulled the paper into the daylight streaming through the blinds. It was a formal, itemized invoice from an exclusive, independent jeweler located in the upscale commercial district downtown. The document detailed a substantial, non-refundable cash deposit placed on a custom-cut, 2-carat diamond engagement ring. My eyes immediately dropped to the printed date at the top corner of the page. The deposit had been secured exactly 2 days after I had explicitly told him I was moving to Boston. I sat back on my heels, holding the crisp receipt between my fingers, feeling a cold, hollow laugh build in the back of my throat. This was not a gesture of overwhelming, sudden clarity. It was not a desperate, romantic epiphany where he suddenly realized he could not live without me. It was a highly calculated emergency brake. He had rushed to a jeweler and dropped thousands of dollars on a custom ring, fully intending to deploy a dramatic, tearful proposal as the ultimate trump card to block my exit. He was preparing to weaponize the very commitment I had spent 3 years waiting for, using it as a shiny, expensive chain to lock me back into his ecosystem. Looking at the exorbitant numbers printed on that invoice, the final, blurry edges of Nolan Price snapped into high-definition reality. He was never a conflicted man tragically torn between 2 vastly different women. He was not paralyzed by a difficult choice. He was an incredibly greedy, highly strategic opportunist. He actively wanted to hoard both of us until the absolute last possible second, keeping Bianca firmly on the hook to feed his ego and build his new business venture, while shackling me with a diamond ring simply to ensure his primary financial and logistical foundation did not collapse before he was ready to jump ship. He was just waiting to see which investment yielded the highest return. The true depth of his desperation finally spilled over the following morning. I was taping shut a heavy cardboard box of kitchen supplies when he walked into the room, looking visibly exhausted, his hair unkempt. The slick, polished veneer he usually wore was entirely stripped away. He stood awkwardly by the kitchen island and, In a voice completely devoid of pride, he issued a direct, pathetic plea. He begged me not to formally sever my name from the residential lease agreement or the utility accounts just yet. He did not frame this request around our shared memories or a lingering hope for reconciliation. He leaned heavily on the marble counter and admitted that right at this exact moment, he desperately needed my pristine, high-tier credit score and my substantial income history attached to his permanent address. He explicitly stated that his new project was in the absolute final stages of securing a crucial round of venture funding, and any sudden, massive disruption to his domestic financial profile or his verifiable proof of residence would instantly terrify the investors and kill the deal. He needed me to be a ghost who still guaranteed his loans and provided a beautiful, stable backdrop for his corporate ambitions. I stood up slowly, wiping the packing dust from my hands. I looked at this man, a man who had orchestrated a sprawling, intricate web of deceit, standing in my kitchen and begging me to continue functioning as his human collateral. I said nothing. The receipt in my pocket told me everything I needed to know. I simply looked at him and offered a faint, incredibly quiet smile. That single, utterly self-serving request was the absolute greatest gift he could have ever given me. It confirmed every single suspicion, validating every cold, calculated move I had made over the past month. I was absolutely never the woman he loved the most. But as I looked into his panicked, desperate eyes, I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that I was the woman he needed the most to make his entire fraudulent existence appear legitimate and safe. The delusion of a habitual liar always peaks just before the inevitable collapse. They become so intoxicated by their own fabricated narratives that they genuinely believe they can talk their way out of a burning building, even as the roof caves in. Exactly 4 days before I was scheduled to hand over my keys and board my final flight to Boston, Nolan approached me in the hallway with the nervous, manic energy of a cornered animal attempting to negotiate a temporary truce. He announced, with a forced, breathless excitement, that M&H Concepts had finally secured a formal venue for their inaugural investor presentation. The pitch was scheduled for Friday evening at a boutique gallery in the South End district. He cornered me near the entryway, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, and explicitly asked me to hold off on finalizing any major logistical changes regarding our shared living situation. He begged me not to make things incredibly difficult or messy right before the biggest night of his professional career, asking for just a few days of absolute peace. While he was pleading for my temporary cooperation to my face, he was actively running a massive, desperate public relations campaign behind my back. My mother called me on Tuesday afternoon, her voice thick with worry, asking if I was experiencing a severe mental health crisis. Nolan had systematically telephoned both of our families, spinning a highly sanitized, deeply patronizing tale. He told them I was simply crumbling under the immense pressure of my corporate obligations. He framed my relocation as a sudden, irrational impulse brought on by severe professional burnout, assuring everyone that he was patiently giving me the space I needed to calm down and come back to my senses. He was aggressively laying the groundwork to ensure that if I did leave, I would be viewed as the unstable, runaway girlfriend, while he remained the tragic, supportive partner who had been unfairly abandoned. But his lies were not contained to just our families. Through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances, I learned exactly what Bianca was anticipating for this upcoming Friday night. She had been loudly boasting to her inner circle that the investor showcase was not merely a business presentation. In her mind, it was their grand official debut. She firmly believed they were going to stand on that stage, secure their capital funding, and publicly step into their new chapter as both corporate founders and a recognized, legitimate couple. Yet, less than 12 hours after I heard about her grand romantic expectations, Nolan knocked softly on my bedroom door. He stood in the doorway, looking deeply conflicted, and swore on his own life that Friday night was merely a transactional necessity. He looked me directly in the eyes and promised that the absolute second the funding check cleared the bank, he was going to legally buy out her half of the company and cut her completely out of his life. He claimed he was doing all of this complicated maneuvering simply to secure our financial future, and that if I could just hold on for one more week, it would be just the two of us again. I sat on the edge of my packed suitcase and simply nodded, offering no verbal confirmation, allowing him to leave the room believing his performance had been flawless. In reality, I was marveling at the sheer, terrifying architecture of his deception. He was actively directing 3 entirely different plays on 3 separate stages for 3 distinct audiences. For Bianca, he was playing the devoted co-founder ready to build an empire and a marriage. For our families, he was the patient saint enduring my mental breakdown. And for me, he was the reluctant businessman playing a dangerous game to save our relationship. While he was busy memorizing his scripts, I was quietly securing the concrete heavy artillery. On Wednesday morning, my attorney sent a secure email containing the final, fully executed legal documents. The severance portfolio was an absolute masterpiece of contract law. It included a formal termination of my liability on the residential lease, effectively immediate upon my departure. It contained a stark, aggressively worded cease and desist order, formally prohibiting my leased address from being utilized for any corporate correspondence, tax filings, or deliveries associated with his company. Most importantly, it included a notarized, legally binding declaration explicitly stating that Avery Alexander held zero financial, operational, or legal affiliations with M&H Concepts or its founders. As I printed those documents onto thick, premium paper, my phone rang. It was the Chief Operating Officer from Northline Civic Systems calling directly from the Boston headquarters. He was not calling to discuss logistics. He was calling to offer a massive, unexpected elevation. He informed me that the executive board had been monitoring my flawless handling of the East Coast Recovery Hub transition remotely. Because of my pristine operational metrics and my unwavering focus during a highly stressful relocation period, they were officially placing me on the vice presidential seed list. If the hub launched successfully over the next 6 months, my promotion to vice president of operations would be fully guaranteed. I hung up the phone and looked around the half-empty Carolina apartment. The contrast was almost blinding. My reality was expanding into a massive, heavily fortified empire of my own making, while his entire existence was built on borrowed money, stolen stability, and a house of cards, waiting for a strong gust of wind. My best friend Leah came over that evening to help me pack my final wardrobe boxes. When I told her about the upcoming investor pitch, she immediately shook her head. She pleaded with me to simply order an airport taxi, get on my flight, and let his fraudulent life naturally implode on its own timeline. She argued that ghosting him entirely was the ultimate power move, a silent statement that he was no longer worth a single ounce of my energy. I listened to her carefully, folding a silk blouse into a cardboard box. Leah was incredibly smart, but she fundamentally misunderstood the necessary mechanics of a true operational shutdown. "If I just leave," I explained softly, taping the box shut, "he will immediately spin my absence. He will stand in front of those investors and paint himself as the stoic visionary who powered through a tragic, sudden breakup. He will use my quiet departure to feed his own mythology. I am not going to give him the luxury of a clean narrative. I am not going to scream at him in a parking lot, Leah, but I am absolutely going to ensure that his lies break in the exact room where he intends to monetize them." Every con artist operates under the fatal delusion that they will always have one final opportunity to talk their way out of a corner. They believe their charisma is an invincible shield that can deflect any consequence. I did not want revenge in the form of a messy, emotional confrontation. I wanted closure in the form of absolute, undeniable facts. Friday evening arrived with a chilling, quiet stillness. The heavy rain from the afternoon had stopped, leaving the city streets slick and reflective under the amber streetlights. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. I bypassed the casual clothes I had been wearing to pack all week. I reached into the protective garment bag and pulled out the sharpest, most impeccably tailored charcoal suit I owned, the exact armor I wore when commanding a boardroom full of difficult contractors and executives. I fastened the buttons, stepped into a pair of black leather heels, and swept my hair back into a flawless, unyielding style. I did not wear a single piece of jewelry he had ever purchased for me. I walked over to the desk and picked up a remarkably thin, sleek black leather folder. Inside rested the freshly printed, fully notarized legal documents from my attorney, crisp and heavy with absolute consequence. I checked my watch. It was exactly 30 minutes before his highly anticipated investor presentation was scheduled to begin across town. He believed he had successfully pacified me. He believed I was sitting quietly in our apartment surrounded by cardboard boxes, paralyzed by my own supposed insecurities, waiting for him to return home and validate my existence. He firmly believed he still controlled the board. I picked up my car keys, walked out the front door, and locked it behind me for the very last time. The air outside was cold, biting, and entirely perfect. I stepped into the night, holding the physical proof of his destruction in my right hand, ready to walk into a room where a liar thought he had already won. I walked into the boutique gallery just as the ambient music faded into a deliberate, expectant silence. The space was sleek, aggressively modern, and filled with exactly the kind of wealthy, influential people Nolan had spent his entire adult life trying to actively impress. He was standing on a slightly elevated platform at the front of the room, bathed in a warm spotlight. He looked phenomenal. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and spoke with the measured, captivating cadence of a man who firmly believed he had already conquered the world. He was delivering his opening remarks, weaving a compelling narrative about creative rebirth, visionary branding, and the limitless future of his new agency. He even had the audacity to pause, offer a humble, self-deprecating smile, and make a vague but deeply manipulative reference to the unwavering, quiet support waiting for him at home. He was actively selling the illusion of my devotion to validate his own character to a room full of strangers. Bianca was positioned a few feet to his right, embodying the absolute picture of a triumphant co-founder. She wore a striking crimson dress, her posture radiating an arrogant certainty. She was scanning the crowd when her eyes finally locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flash of smug satisfaction cross her features. She expected to see a shattered, desperate woman standing in the back of the room, clutching a tissue and begging for scraps of attention. Instead, she found me standing perfectly upright in my charcoal executive armor, holding a sleek black folder, exuding the cold, untouchable energy of a corporate executioner. The smugness on her face rapidly dissolved into a tight, nervous confusion. I did not look like a woman who had come to fight for a man. I looked like a woman who had come to collect a debt. Nolan finished his opening monologue and opened the floor to the primary financial backers, a silver-haired man sitting in the front row, clearly the lead investor for the evening, leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. He did not ask about color palettes or event themes. He asked the only question that actually mattered. He wanted to know about their operational runway and their personal financial stability during the high-risk, early stages of the startup. He specifically asked Nolan how he planned to guarantee the company's overhead while maintaining his own cost of living. Considering the highly volatile nature of the boutique event industry, Nolan opened his mouth, fully prepared to deploy another charming, evasive lie about his heavily secured domestic infrastructure. I did not give him the chance to draw a single breath. I stepped forward, my leather heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor, cutting directly through the silence of the gallery. Perhaps I can provide some immediate clarity regarding the operational foundation, I announced. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a sharp, cutting authority that instantly commanded the attention of every single person in the room. Nolan froze entirely. The color violently drained from his face as he stared at me, his charming smile collapsing into an expression of sheer, unadulterated panic. I stopped at the edge of the seating area, looking directly at the lead investor, and calmly opened the black folder. I did not scream. I did not narrate a tragic tale of betrayal. I simply delivered the cold legal facts. Effective as of this very afternoon, I hold absolutely zero legal, financial, or residential affiliations with Nolan Price or his newly formed corporate entity, I stated cleanly. The luxury apartment he currently resides in is no longer authorized to serve as the registered mailing address or the logistical headquarters for this business. My financial obligations to his residential lease have been entirely severed, and my personal income will no longer serve as the silent collateral for his stability. Any assumptions regarding a secured, subsidized runway provided by my presence are entirely null and void. The atmosphere in the room shifted violently, dropping in temperature by several degrees. The investors immediately began murmuring, exchanging sharp, concerned glances. The lead investor frowned deeply, pulling a pen from his pocket to make a hard, definitive mark across his legal pad. Bianca whipped her head around to stare at Nolan. The absolute horror dawning on her face was not about losing me, it was about realizing she had been conned as well. She finally understood that a massive portion of their business plan was constructed upon a foundation of my financial presence, a presence Nolan never possessed the actual right to promise her. He had lied to her about his independence just as smoothly as he had lied to me about his loyalty. In the middle of the escalating chaos, with Nolan desperately trying to stammer out a coherent defense to the investors, I delivered the final, fatal cut. I looked at both of them, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. He told each of us an entirely different, highly customized version of the future, I said, ensuring the investors heard every single syllable. The only actual truth in this room is that he desperately wanted both women to stand perfectly still, subsidizing his life, just long enough for him to calculate which option yielded the highest financial return. I am simply removing my capital from the equation. The lead investor stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a definitive snap. We are going to need to pause this presentation and heavily review our risk assessment, he announced coldly, signaling the end of the night. Bianca did not utter a single word to Nolan. She turned on her heel, her face a mask of absolute fury, and marched out the side door of the gallery, leaving him behind. Nolan stood completely alone on the stage, his hands gripping the edges of the podium, entirely stripped of the effortless control he had always used to make me question my own sanity. He looked small, transparent, and utterly ruined. I closed the black folder, turned around, and walked out the front doors of the gallery. I stepped into the cool night air, and I did not look back a single time. The very next morning, I boarded a direct flight to Boston. I officially assumed my role as the executive director, carrying only the belongings that were rightfully mine, and leaving behind absolutely zero explanations for the man who had laughed at my boundaries. 6 months passed with breathtaking speed. The East Coast Recovery Hub launched flawlessly under my meticulous direction. Because of the overwhelming success of the first 2 quarters, I was officially elevated to Vice President of Operations weeks ahead of the projected schedule. I celebrated by purchasing a stunning high-rise condominium in the financial district, using only my own money, secured entirely under my own name. As for the wreckage I left behind in Carolina, the updates occasionally filtered through mutual acquaintances. M&H Concepts completely dissolved before they ever secured a single client, their funding permanently pulled after the disastrous gallery presentation. Bianca relocated to a different state shortly after the fallout. Refusing to ever speak his name again, Nolan remained in the city, but the pristine, evolved facade was permanently shattered. He simply became a cautionary tale, the kind of man everyone immediately recognizes as charming right up until the exact moment it is entirely too late. Sitting in my new office, looking out over the skyline I had conquered, I finally understood the lesson. The most precious thing I had ever accepted was not the relocation to Boston, nor was it the prestigious executive title. It was the absolute, undeniable truth that love should never require a woman to shrink her own future just to perfectly fit the profound dishonesty of a small man. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, I invite you to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.